Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Dershowitz.
Thank you so much. I wish I could be with you. I love The Hague. I love your country. And I wish I could be there in person, but unfortunately I'm in beautiful New York. And I'm going to speak to you for a few minutes on the issue of international law and human rights and Israel. Let me start out with a general point of view about human rights and about rights. And of course, there's no more appropriate place to speak about human rights than the Hague. In my experience, rights come from wrongs. That is, we in the world see wrongs that exist, and as the result of seeing the wrongs and trying to prevent them from happening again, we create rights. I guess the primary example of that would be the wrongs of the First and Second World Wars, where we experienced extraordinary numbers of civilian deaths, most particularly in the Second World War, where the goal of Nazism was to inflict the maximum number of civilian deaths on, of course, the Jewish population. We saw Stalinism trying to impose civilian deaths on people in Ukraine. And as the result, following the Second World War, we articulated a series of distinctions that became an important part of international law. The International Criminal Court, located in The Hague, obviously implements those important principles in enforcing them in the effort to prevent genocide, which is an attack on civilians. And the two most important principles that derived from the wrongs of the First and Second World War were the principles of distinction and the principles of proportionality. Let me explain them both very briefly. The principle of distinction seemed like a very easy one in 1946 and 1947. All armies are required to distinguish between civilians or ordinary people and soldiers, who are people who are in uniform, are part of a hierarchical military organization, and bear arms. It is perfectly permissible in a war to attack combatants, to attack soldiers who wear uniforms. But it is not permissible to do, for example, what the British and Americans did in Dresden, carpet bombing a city, what the United States did in Tokyo, bombing an entire city of Tokyo, or what the United States did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, dropping nuclear weapons on primarily civilian targets. So that's the principle of distinction, and it's a very, very important one, and I'll talk about how it's being violated today. The second important principle is the principle of proportionality. And what does proportionality mean? Let me first explain to you what it doesn't mean. It does not mean that when you're fighting against the enemy, the number of deaths that are caused on your side have to be proportional to the number of deaths caused on the other side. That's not the principle of proportionality. If an enemy army attacks you and kills 10 of your people, you can respond by killing 1,000 of their soldiers. There is no requirement of proportionality between the number of soldiers killed under the principles of distinction. The principle of proportionality means as follows, that if you are attacking a proper military target, say an army base or a rocket launching facility, and you know that there are going to be some civilians in the area, and you have no choice but to attack the military target because the military target is attacking your people, you have to find proportionality between the number of civilians that you expect to kill and the value of the military target. So let me give you an example. If you have a single terrorist and he goes and he hides in a hospital filled with civilians, and you want to kill that terrorist, you cannot attack the hospital in an effort to kill one civilian, because the number, one terrorist, because the number of civilians who will die in the process is disproportionate to the value of the military target. On the other hand, if you have a nuclear weapon, that is in a hospital and the nuclear weapon is about to be launched and may kill 100,000 of your people, you may attack that nuclear weapon, even if it's located in a hospital or a school, because the value of the military target is so great that the killing of a substantial number of civilians is proportional. So those are the principles that were established at the end of the Second World War. They were based on principles that had been established after the First World War, but they were really put into effect most effectively following the Second World War. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that the current war that Western countries are facing, whether it's Brussels or Amsterdam or Paris or the United States or Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, the current wars we're facing don't involve soldiers wearing uniforms that are part of a hierarchical military organization that bears arms in the traditional sense. What we are fighting are terrorists who might be grocers or bakers during the day and people who make suicide bombs at night or fire rockets at night. They don't wear distinctive uniforms. They are not necessarily part of a hierarchical organization, or if they are, we don't have a full understanding of the hierarchy of the organization. I mentioned at the outset of my talk that rights from wrongs, but it's equally true sometimes that wrongs come from rights. And the very principles of distinction and proportionality that focus so heavily on civilians have created an incentive among terrorists and terrorist groups to, in fact, use civilians as weapons against other civilians. And that's the war we're now fighting. We're fighting a war in which combatants, who are called terrorists, even though they don't wear uniforms, but they're combatants, their goal is to kill enemy civilians or just ordinary civilians, ordinary people. And in order to protect themselves, they hide among civilians. The most obvious example of that was during the two wars that Israel fought with Hamas in Gaza. Hamas used civilians to commit a double war crime. What they would do is they would put their rockets in the most densely populated areas of Gaza City and fire those rockets from those densely populated areas at Israeli civilians. They would usually pick a time, 7:30 or so in the morning, when they knew school buses were on the roads taking children to school, in the hope of managing to hit a school bus or a school and killing a maximum number of children. We saw just the other day that in Turkey it was revealed that there were going to be efforts to try to attack Jewish schools with children, Jewish synagogues, etc. So the goal is to maximize civilian casualties among your enemies while creating a kind of barrier against the army attacking your rocket launchers by putting them in civilian areas. Now, we've all heard the myth, for example, in Gaza, that Gaza is a very, very densely populated area. That is simply false. Gaza is not densely populated compared to Amsterdam, compared to The Hague, compared to New York, compared to Tel Aviv, because it doesn't have high-rise buildings for the most part. It has, for the most part, low buildings. Moreover, there are many areas in the Gaza Strip that have virtually no populations, that are open areas, open farms, open areas. Rockets could be fired from those areas, but if they were fired from those areas, the Israeli military would be able to respond in a proportional way and destroy the rockets without harming any civilians. So Hamas has made a deliberate, willful decision, not a decision out of necessity, but a decision out of choice, to place their rockets in the most densely populated parts of Gaza City in order to put the Israeli military to a Hobson's choice, to a difficult choice. Either allow the rocket to continue to kill your civilians or respond knowing that you're going to kill some civilians who are being used as human shields. And of course, we all remember that the Goldstone report and other reports of the United Nations Commission or Council on Human Rights has attacked Israel for killing 400, 500, 600 civilians in the process of protecting their own civilians. That creates a dilemma for any civilized society under the rule of law as to how it is going to fight attacks on its civilians. Let me give you two examples of what Israel may very well face within the next decade. Number one will be Hezbollah. It is now estimated Hezbollah has anywhere between 30,000 and 150,000 rockets aimed at the heart of Israel, aimed not only at civilian targets such as hospitals and schools, and these are guided missiles. These are not just the kinds of missiles that come from Gaza. These are missiles with guidance systems. And we have been told by Hezbollah itself that they are aimed at gas facilities, they are aimed at nuclear facilities, they're aimed at facilities designed to maximize the number of civilian deaths. And no country in the world has to accept, without responding or trying to prevent, attacks on its civilians that could kill hundreds of thousands of Israelis. But what if Israel is put to the terrible, tragic choice that the only way it can prevent these attacks on its civilians is by attacking the areas where the Hezbollah has placed its guided missiles? And those areas include civilian areas. And so Israel will have to make the tragic choice of killing civilians in order to prevent the killing of its own civilians. That will be a terrible, terrible decision it has to make, but it's a decision that has been inflicted on Israel by the tactic used by Hezbollah. Now, Lebanon is a spacious country. There are many areas from which Hezbollah can fire its rockets that don't endanger civilians. But Hezbollah has made the decision to hide its rockets and its rocket launchers among civilians. So that's an issue that Israel may very well face in the next 2, 3, or 5 years. Let me tell you about an even more serious problem that Israel may face. Assume that the Iran deal, the deal with the Iran nuclear program, holds for the next 7 or 8 or 9 years. At the end of the deal, Iran is going to be permitted, at least under the deal itself, to begin to develop a nuclear arsenal. Now, where is it going to place its nuclear arsenal? It's going to place it in civilian areas. We already know that some of the development programs for Iran's nuclear weapons were placed in the basements of hospitals, in the basements of schools, or in areas of close proximity cities. And so if Israel decides, or the United States decides, or NATO decides that it will have to destroy Iran's nuclear arsenal, or its prelude to developing a nuclear arsenal, it will not be able to do that without endangering considerable numbers of civilians. Excuse me. Indeed, if it waits too long, and it waits until Iran actually develops the nuclear arsenal, the only way to destroy it might cause radiation damage areas where the nuclear facilities exist. These are terrible, tragic choices that the current law of distinction and proportionality don't address. And so my proposal is that we have to adapt international law, particularly international law that deals with the principles of distinction and principles of proportionality. They have to be changed, and they have to be adapted to the new reality of terrorists using civilians as weapons and as human shields. Now, right now, international law protects terrorists far too much and protects soldiers far too little. I don't know how many of you realize that under current international law, it is perfectly appropriate to kill sleeping soldiers while they're asleep, even if the soldiers themselves, although they wear uniforms, are cooks rather than weapon carriers, or are musicians. Now, the law does protect medics, but it doesn't protect intelligence officers, musicians that play for the army, cooks that feed the army. As long as you're part of an army, it is perfectly appropriate for another army to try to kill you in your sleep to prevent your army from becoming stronger and launching military attacks. So there is very little protection of soldiers who, many of them are drafted, many of them are 18 or 19-year-old kids. But once they put on a uniform and a part of the armed forces, part of a hierarchical armed forces, the current laws of distinction and proportionality give them almost no protection. But the current laws do protect people who are determined killers, who are sworn to kill as many civilians as possible if they don't wear uniforms. For example, the Israeli Supreme Court, in the last decision rendered by one of its greatest justices in history, Justice Aaron Barak, rendered a decision which articulated what Israel is entitled to do under international law to prevent terrorists from attacking its civilians. And what it did is it said that if a person is a non-combatant, that is a non-member of a formal military, then the person essentially has to be in the process of engaging in a terrorist attack. Now, obviously, if somebody is coming at you with a knife or coming at you with a suicide bomb and is in the act of engaging in terrorism, that person is a combatant for all intents and purposes. But what if that person has engaged in terrorist activities during the day, goes home to sleep, and then is going to be engaged in terrorist activity the next day again? Is that person a combatant from 10 o'clock at night until 4 o'clock in the morning, so that if the Israeli military manages to find him in his sleep, he can be killed? The answers to those questions are not completely clear under international law. So under international law today, the question is, who is a terrorist? When is the person a terrorist? Where is the person a terrorist? And how can a democratic country trying to protect its civilians against terrorism, how can that person respond? And what I've tried to come up with in response to these problems is a new approach to who is a civilian and who is a combatant. I call it, and it's an awkward term, a continuum of civilianality and a continuum of combatality. Now, those are not very precise terms, but what I mean to suggest is that there is a continuum. On the civilian side of the continuum, for example, there is the innocent child, there is the 90-year-old woman, there is the person who has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of combat. On the combatant end of it is obviously the commander of Hamas, the head of the terrorist unit. But in between, there are a range of types of people. There are people who allow their homes to be used to store weapons. There are people who help knit the belt on which the suicide explosives will be placed. There are people who reward the terrorists after they complete their act or reward the family. There are people who put up the signs praising the terrorists as martyrs and shaheeds. So it's very important that current international law understand that we're talking about a continuum and that the rule should say that it is more permissible to attack people who are closer to the combatant end of the continuum than they are to the civilian end of the continuum. It also has to recognize that there are some people who serve as human shields voluntarily, others who are forced to serve as human shield. For example, when Israel several years ago managed to kill one of the leading terrorists who was planning to blow up a gas facility in Ashdod, which could have killed 10,000 people, they tried to kill him when he was alone, but they couldn't find him alone. And they did manage to kill him, but along with him were killed his wife and some other relatives. Now, the question was, is his wife a civilian or is she a combatant? The answer to that question may turn on whether she voluntarily stays with him in order to provide him with cover or whether she has been forced to stay with him as the result of pressure. These are hard questions. These are questions that the law must respond to. Now, I want to turn to a reality. And the reality is that Israel is subjected to a double standard when it comes to how it can protect against civilians. There was a very interesting cartoon that appeared in the paper the other day. It showed a Muslim woman at a checkpoint being searched and being checked before she could cross over from one area to the other. And it made it look like the checkpoint was in Israel. And it called for sanctions against Israel, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And then it pulled back and it showed, no, this was a checkpoint in Brussels. And nobody seemed to care that checkpoints were being used in Brussels or in Paris or in other parts of the world. But when Israel employs defensive measures to protect its own civilians, a very, very different standard tends to apply. And so how do you respond to that? Well, to me, the best way to respond to it is to seek a change in the international law regarding disproportionality and distinction in advance of what Israel may have to do in the next 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. My feeling is that a group of academics ought to come to The Hague and petition the International Criminal Court and petition other institutions to come up in advance with answers to the hard questions. What should a country be able to do, without naming the country? What should a country be able to do when terrorists hide among civilians and make it impossible to attack the terrorists without killing civilians? What is the proper rule of proportionality in such a situation? What is the proper approach to the principles of distinction? Let there be rules articulated in advance that apply to every country. There is a great philosopher who was a colleague of mine, and I knew him well when he was at Harvard. We were in study groups together. His name was John Rawls. He's a very well-known legal philosopher. And John Rawls came up with a principle in which he said justice can be done only if you don't know who the victims are, you don't know who the perpetrators are. You have to create systems of justice under what he called the veil of ignorance. So you have to construct systems without knowing in advance whether you're going to be white or black, male or female, poor or rich, live in a Western country or a non-Western country. And that kind of principle pressures you to create equal justice because you don't know which side you're going to be on. And I think the same thing has to be true with regard to rules of justice in the international format. And so we have to get groups of people sitting together and revising the current international law dealing with civilians, with distinction, with proportionality, without knowing whether those rules are going to be used by Israel, whether they're going to be used by Holland, whether they're going to be used by Belgium, whether they're going to be used by France, whether they're going to be used by Turkey, whether they're going to be used by Jordan or Egypt. And it seems to me if we got together and understood the new war that is being fought using civilians as weapons, we could come up with better approaches to how to fight terrorism than the current approach, which simply blames Israel. Now, for example, in the Goldstone report criticized Israel for attacking military targets causing civilian deaths. Now, what if Israel had, in advance of the Goldstone report, in advance of going into Gaza, had sought a declaratory judgment from the International Criminal Court, an advanced judgment, asking the International Criminal Court, what is the proper way of trying to prevent terrorist rockets or terrorist tunnels from being dug in your areas that endanger your civilians? What answers would international tribunals or international legislative bodies give? That, it seems to me, is the challenge we face today. Yes, rights come from wrongs. Yes, wrongs come from rights when those rights are not appropriately adapted to the new realities of war. So I think the challenge of international law today is to come up with rules of proportionality and rules of distinction that fairly balance the need to protect civilians against the use of military force that will endanger civilians who are being used as human shields. So that's my challenge to you at this conference. Come up with ways of doing that, and come up with ways that are fair to all countries, and particularly come up with ways that don't single out Israel, because as we all know, Israel is always the canary in the mine. Israel, what happens to Israel first, what happens to Jews first, then happen to other people in the world. We're seeing that in Brussels, we're seeing that in Paris, we're going to see that in other parts of the world today. And so it's important that Israel not be singled out for a double standard, but that the experiences that Israel has and the way it's fought back be used as an example. Let me close with a challenge that I posed to students a few months ago when I was asked to debate against the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divest, Sanction movement, at Oxford University at the Oxford Union. I was told that there was no way that a pro-Israel speaker could ever win a debate at the Oxford Union. But we ended up winning the debate. And one reason is I threw out the following challenge to the students at Oxford, hundreds of them sitting in the Oxford Union. I walked out into the audience and I said, I challenge you to name one country in the history of the world, one country faced with threats comparable to those that Israel faces every single day, both internally and externally. Name one country faced with comparable threats that has had a better record of human rights, a better record of compliance with the rules of law, and a better record of showing concern for civilians among the enemy side. And I stood there and not a single person was prepared to shout out the name of a single country, because there is no country in the world faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel that has had a better record in trying to combat the scourge of terrorism. And when the best is regarded as the worst, when the best, Israel, is the one against which sanctions are directed, and no sanctions are directed against those countries that use civilians to protect their military activities, we know that something's wrong with the international order. So I thank you very much for listening, and I welcome a few questions from you before I have to leave for my next speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dershowitz. I will start with two small questions, and then we will see. We have 10 minutes for questions. Is that okay? Because we started a bit late.
Questions, but speak quickly because I can't hear you too well.
Okay, so we'll try to be louder. My first comment would we'll consider that your continuums you were talking about. Isn't the problem those areas which I will, for the ease of speech, call the gray areas? Who decides where they belong? Is that not the biggest problem we are all facing? And a second comment I would like to make is related to, how shall I say, to me, well, not being a law person, the feeling that formal law and what I would maybe call natural law, I'm not sure that's the right word, sometimes coincide. And how do we solve that problem? Because as a non-law person, I often feel that the cold language of law does not cover the emotions we all feel in regard to what's happening. And of course, when we see pictures and video forms of things, we see little kids suffering, and we can tell a whole story about distinctions and about proportionality. But then you see a small child dying, or a small child on the seashore. How do you go about that?
Okay, so I agree, and I have actually come up with a term to cover that. Hamas understands that very well, and Hamas has come up with what they themselves call their dead baby strategy. They very deliberately put young children, babies, in harm's way. They have cameras ready, and they bring out the cameras and they bring out the crying mother holding the dead baby, knowing that they will get enormous emotional reaction from the world when they show the dead baby. Because the camera doesn't show Hamas putting the baby in harm's way. It doesn't show Hamas not allowing families to leave. All it shows is the result. The dead baby being held by the crying mother. And that kind of emotional impact, you're absolutely right, is hard to respond to by cold laws. And you talk, and so we have to expose this dead baby strategy for what it is, really a triple war crime, because it attacks Israeli civilians, it uses human shields, and then it uses children and babies and women and most vulnerable populations in order to be able to garner emotional support. And once that's exposed, I think the finger of blame will be pointed to the people who are responsible for that. Hamas for not letting the families leave. Remember what Israel does. It makes phone calls first. It sends texts. It then drops little bomblets on the roof to make noise. It gives the family an hour or half an hour to leave the building, and then it will attack the building. So if a young child is left behind in the building deliberately by Hamas, in order to be able to parade it out to the cameras, the world has to be able to point its finger of blame at that Hamas commander rather than at the Israeli government that had to take actions to protect itself. You talk about gray areas, that's precisely what I'm talking about. It's the gray areas that we have to know what the answer is in advance. You can't wait until the dead baby is paraded around, because then you're going to get an emotional response. You have to be able to analyze this thing logically, coherently, and morally before the emotional impact hits. And that's what I'm calling for. Advanced laws, refined, sophisticated, nuanced rules that take into account the realities you've just described.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Dershowitz. My name is Chaim Divon. I'm the ambassador of Israel here in the Netherlands. And first of all, thank you very much for a great speech of yours. We are here facing the ICC, ICJ. I have a great difficulty with the opinion of the ICJ regarding the wall, which I think is totally the security fence, which I thought then was totally out of reality, in particular following the judgment of Chief Justice Barak that you mentioned. I would like you, and this is, by the way, this is an argument that used against us again and again and again, and I would love to hear your comments about it. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, I would make a very sharp distinction between the ICC and the ICJ. The International Court of Justice is not international, it's not a court, and it has nothing to do with justice. It's a sham, and it is not international because Israel has never been invited to serve in a permanent capacity on it. It is not a court because its judges represent the policies of its government, and it has nothing to do with justice as reflected by many of its decisions. It is a United Nations organ, and anything that comes from the United Nations is going to be biased and bigoted, as evidenced by the Geneva focus of the International Human Rights Council. The International Criminal Court is quite different. It was created by the Rome Treaty. It is not a creature or a product of the United Nations, though it has references from the United Nations. The Security Council can refer cases to it. And I have an open mind about the International Criminal Court. Its first prosecutor, Louis Ocampo, was a superb prosecutor and a superb gentleman, and somebody who is fair, somebody who I've worked with over the years. I haven't had experience with the current prosecutor yet, and I await judgment. But I'm very concerned about the International Criminal Court because there's been enormous pressure on it to go after Israel and to go after non-African nations. Now, the rules of the International Criminal Court have to be clear. It has to be the worst first. That has to be the criteria. You have to go after the worst genocides first, and those have occurred for the most part in Africa. And you have to go after countries where there is no opportunity to get remedies within the countries. And those are all part of the Rome Treaty. You have to give the country an opportunity first to deal with its problems. And by those standards, the worst first, and you go after countries that have no internal mechanisms, Israel would be virtually in the bottom of any list of targets of the ICC. And if the ICC begins to focus on, whether a few more homes are being built in the West Bank, or whether you can criticize Israel's policies on settlements, and I myself have been critical of Israel's policies on settlements, but that doesn't rise to the level of war crimes of the kind that have occurred in parts of Africa and other parts of the world. So I think that it's very important that the International Criminal Court develop a system of priorities that makes sure it goes after the worst first and doesn't, as the result of pressure, single out the only democracy in the Middle East, a democracy that is faced with threats of external and internal terrorism, and a democracy that has done more to comport with the rule of law than any other country faced with comparable threats. So I remain hopeful of the ICC. I have absolutely no faith in the ICJ, and I think it ought to be criticized and condemned at every level for what it is, a political creature of the United Nations that reflects the foreign policies of many of the most despotic countries in the world and has nothing to do with justice whatsoever.
Thank you for your contribution to this symposium. I was wondering, I'm seeing another development in the world of religions. Of course, the Middle Eastern question is deep down at the bottom a religious question. And in terms of the World Parliament of Religions in 1993 calling for a global ethic, how do you see this development, this call towards a global ethic in the context of the Middle East?
Well, first of all, I think religion is a sword that cuts both ways. It reflects both the best and the worst of human morality. Obviously, so much bad has been done in the name of religion, and so much good has been done in the name of religion. Religion should never serve as an excuse or a justification for criminality, whether it be terrorism engaged in by Muslims who are attacking Jews, or by Jews, extremist Jews, who attack either Muslims or other Jews. Some of you may know that when the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin occurred, there was an attempt to justify that on religious grounds. Fortunately, the Israeli courts rejected that, as they should. So religion must be seen as a voluntary organization that people can join religious groups if they choose to, can leave them if they choose to. There should be no coercion, no pressure. Religion, and religion should never serve as an excuse for violence. Religion is part of the marketplace of ideas, just like philosophy and anything else, and people should use the best elements of philosophy, of religion, of any other ethic that they can come up with to try to come to the best resolutions. But religion should never be an excuse. God told me to do it is off the table when it comes to any kind of legal justification or moral justification for doing anything that hurts other people.